Thanks for coming out. It's a little bit like church, Lawrence, that everyone sits in the back half today, right? So, but I'm glad to see you all. My name is Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of lectures, discussions, and conferences that bring people together around questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also support work in Jewish-Christian understanding and in global approaches to Catholicism. This afternoon, I'm really delighted to welcome Jim O'Toole, a professor emeritus of history at Boston College, whose work I've admired for many, many years. He's a writer who gives people who might not ever want to read a Catholic history reason to want to do so. And as I'll say, even people who might not ever read a book about a cardinal, reason to do so. Two books are well seared in my memory that he's written. One has to be well seared because I enthusiastically loaned it out to someone and never got it back, so if the culprit is here, please hand it back over. That's one book that I love is called Militant and Triumphant, William Henry O'Connell and the Catholic Church in Boston, which was at the same time shockingly scandalous, not in the one way we've gotten used to scandal, but in many, many other ways, and a real window into Boston Catholic life and culture in the early part of the 19th century. Well worth reading. Second book is particularly important to us at Holy Cross, a great book that also gives us great cultural insight from the experience of a single family. It's called Passing for White, Race, Religion, and the Healy Family, 1820 to 1920. I don't know how many of you lived in Healy Hall over here. You get the connection that we've got here, and Fenwick and a number of other things. So Healy was one of the brothers was the first valedictorian at Holy Cross. If you're interested in Holy Cross or in history and politics of race or Catholic history, it's a really great book to read. So I'd recommend both of these for anyone who wants a larger history of American Catholicism or even of American Catholicism's place in the larger culture. But today brings us to a new book. I skipped over his big history, his Harvard-published history of American Catholicism, but we'll come to a new book. For much of the 20th century, sacramental confession was central to American Catholic life. Confession was not only a ritual of reconciliation, but a practice that shaped moral reasoning, reinforced communal expectations, and structured the relationship between individual conscience and church authority. Beginning in the late 1960s and early 70s, however, this practice declined rapidly. Within a generation, something that was once taken for granted became unfamiliar to many American Catholics. The shift raises important questions. What conditions once supported widespread participation in confession? How did parish life and devotional culture sustain it? And how did the changes associated with Vatican II, along with broader cultural trends towards individualism and therapeutic models of the self, reshape Catholic moral life? This afternoon's lecture explores these through a careful historical analysis, placing confession within the longer story of American Catholicism and within wider debates about religion and modernity. Here's the book that we're going to talk about a little bit. Today's lecture is made possible by the Deitchman family, Lectures in Religion and Modernity. We're grateful to John Deitchman of the class of 1970 and his family for their support. And after Professor O'Toole's remarks, we'll have time for questions and discussions. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure, as it always is, for me to be back at Holy Cross. Pleasure to be back in the city of my birth. We moved away when I was 2, but I was in fact born here. And I'm happy to talk about my new book on the history of the practice of confession by American Catholics. And I want to begin by asking you to picture in your mind's eye a few snapshots. Picture these scenes. St. Louis, Missouri, 1807. Still a relatively new place. The territory around it had been occupied for generations by native peoples, of course, and then claimed by a succession of empires from Europe, and in 1807, finally, by the United States. Small town still, and a Catholic priest comes up the river from New Orleans to serve the few scattered Catholics who are in and around St. Louis. He finds, he says in his diary, all kinds of debaucheries, the worst of which he thinks is dancing. Society is obviously not as it should be in his mind. But he's trying to bring some religious understanding, some religious leaven to this debauched place. And after some farm animals are killed by lightning in a violent thunderstorm, he preaches a very stern sermon explaining what just happened. God is incensed, he says, at those debaucheries and sins, and the people need to repent. At least some people hear the message, and he then reports that he is overloaded with people who want to go to confession in response to that natural occurrence. He even asked for another priest to come up from New Orleans to help him out. There's so much. A second snapshot, New York City, 1897, 90 years later. This is not a new place, but a very old place. It's a bustling metropolis that's full of churches of all denominations. And one of those is the Church of St. Ignatius on Park Avenue. It's a Jesuit parish. The Catholics there don't need to be scared into confession by thunder and lightning. Confession has become a part of their regular religious routine and practice. It's something that they, Catholics, do that their Protestant and other non-Catholic neighbors do not do. With, I think, characteristic Jesuit organizational skill, the priests of that parish count the number of confessions that they hear every year. They keep track. And for 1896-97, I think it's interesting, by the way, that they calculate on the fiscal year. In that parish, they report that they have heard they rounded off at about 78,000 confessions over the course of the year. At the other Jesuit parish in Manhattan, St. Francis Xavier, which is farther downtown, they're more precise. And at Francis Xavier for that year, they report hearing 173,394 confessions. Not 395, 394. Now, of course, there are not that many parishioners in these parishes, but every time a parishioner comes to confession anew, they're counted anew every time, and that's why the numbers are as high as they are. One of the priests at St. Ignatius Parish is Patrick Healy, one of the famous Healy brothers from Holy Cross. And he keeps his own count of the number of confessions that he's hearing out of that total, in that parish, 78,000. I think he probably made a hash mark on a sheet of paper every time a new penitent came into his confessional. And he later transferred these numbers into his diary. He added them up week to week, month to month, almost like an accountant. But what struck me in his diaries, I was reading his diaries for another purpose altogether, the book that Tom had mentioned. What struck me about the way he talked about his confessions was the language he used. One day, for example, he thought the pace was slack because he heard only 88. Another time, 77 confessions at a single sitting he described as few. And yet again, 107 one day were not numerous. The sense of disappointment that he had in those numbers, it seems to me, is a measure of how ingrained the practice of confession had become and the level of expectation that it created for him. A third snapshot, New Orleans, 1951, moving forward in time. A Jesuit sociologist from Loyola University in New Orleans named Joseph Fichter is studying an all-white parish in the city of New Orleans. And as sociologists do, he counted everything. Parish population, enrollment in the schools, other weekly mass attendance, and other things. And he counted confessions. Confessions were heard mostly on Saturday afternoon and evening, but other times too. And he counted separately the number of confessions from kids in the parish school. Altogether, he computed that there were about 18,000 confessions altogether in that parish for the whole year. the busiest months, he charted it out again, as sociologists do. He charted out the busiest months for hearing confessions were March and May. March, which included the Saturday before Easter, and May, which included the Saturday before Mother's Day. Want to do something nice for your mother? Go to confession for Mother's Day. Make that a present for her. But Fichter also interviewed a number of the parishioners to get a sense of what their experience of confession was, and to get a sense of the interaction between people in the parish and the priests of the parish. The pastor was apparently rather stern, especially when hearing confessions. But at least one layman in the parish, said that he liked that. He liked getting bawled out for his sins, that he thought it was good for him to be bawled out by the pastor. One of the curates was a careful and sympathetic listener. His French was also the best on the parish staff for parishioners who were most comfortable in that language. And then there was another young curate who was praised because, as one parishioner said, he didn't take all day in hearing confessions. And so my last snapshot here, a very different one. Moving forward again in time, not the 170,000 confessions in New York, not the 18,000 confessions in New Orleans. This comes from a study done at Notre Dame University in 1987. It was a nationwide survey of what they called core Catholics. These are the folks who were most actively involved in their local parishes. Lectors, Eucharistic ministers, the people who run the food bank, choir members, and so on, the people who are most committed to their local parish. How often, the study asked, do those folks go to confession? Again, this is 1987. 26% say never. 35% say they go maybe once a year. Maybe. Monthly confession, long presented by clergy as a standard for lay people. Monthly confessions, about 6% of those core Catholics. What had once been common practice, regular confession, was clearly dying out. And there were other studies that found the same percentages. One priest had come to call, by the 1980s, had come to call confession a ghost sacrament. Still on the books, but not many people did it. So my question as a historian was, what happened? How did something that was practiced for so long by so many become so rare? And, for that matter, so quickly? How and why did this distinctive marker of Catholic identity disappear so rapidly? We don't usually see historical change happen that fast and on that large a scale. So I wanted to chart and understand confession's rise, how it had become so common and routine among American Catholics, and then its fall, how it had become so rare. So some words about the rise. The early missionaries in the territory that subsequently became the United States encouraged Catholics to make confession a part of their regular, routine religious practice. But that was often difficult. Catholics in the early years were few in number and scattered around the countryside. There were few church buildings. And missionary priests, they were all missionaries, were constantly on the move. In many places, Catholics might be able to attend Mass a couple of times a year at most when a priest rode into town. One priest in Maryland in the 1750s described in a letter that he had to ride every week a circuit of about 300 miles around Maryland. Another priest in that same area reported that every week he rode 25 miles to Maryland and Pennsylvania to visit scattered communities of Catholics there. And once a month, he rode 50 miles in the opposite direction to visit a congregation in Virginia. At every stop, missionaries like those heard confessions first. People hadn't had the chance to go to confession for a long time, and so they went to confession so they could then receive communion at Mass. But by the middle of the 19th century and into the 20th century, an infrastructure for the church is being put into place. There are parish churches, especially in cities, that are now crowded with Catholic immigrants. Priests can now urge their parishioners to make regular confession a part of their practice because it's available, as it never had been before. And parishioners can and do heed the call. Confession becomes a habit for them. Some more snapshots. Father James Walsh in Boston, a slightly younger contemporary of Patrick Healy, in 1900. He and 3 other priests in a parish in the Roxbury neighborhood full of Irish and German immigrants. He and 3 other priests hear confessions every Saturday from 3 to 6 in the afternoon, followed by a break, and then again from 7:30 to 9:30 at night. In Detroit, in the 1920s, there's a similar schedule on Saturdays. And this one parish also hears confessions every weekday after the 6 a.m. morning Mass and before the 8 a.m. morning Mass. So it's not just a Saturday thing, it's every day of the week. And that's further underlined by the fact that there's a priest hearing confessions every evening for half an hour starting at 7:30. There is obviously, it seems to me, a kind of supply and demand dynamic at work here. So much demand for confession that parishes set aside that much time for the hearing of confessions. I think it's also likely, by the way, that that much supply of confession helped create the demand, helped support the demand on the part of Catholics. In many places, the crowds were such that pastors sometimes steered their parishioners to come to confession at one time and not another. At one working class parish I found, 4 priests were hearing confessions every Saturday, 3:30 to 6, 7 to 9:30. But children were told to come to confession not on Saturday, but on Friday afternoon. And they might be shooed away if they came on Saturday, get them out of the way of the adults. And further, on Saturday in this parish, the pastor urged women to come in the afternoon and therefore leave room for confessions of working men who could only come to confession after work on Saturday evening. Again, just trying to manage the crowd was necessary because the crowds were as large as they were. Other devotional activities in parishes encouraged regular confession as well. Parish societies, the Holy Name Society, the Ladies' Sodality, the CYO, all of these organizations had a practice of monthly Mass in a body and communion, and that encouraged monthly confession. The First Friday devotion, which was popular, the idea was if you went to Mass and took communion on the first Friday of 9 successive months, there were particular benefits that came from that. Communion on the first Friday implied going to confession the day before. Parish missions. I say a good deal in the book about parish missions, intense religious revivals, essentially, that move from parish to parish. 1 or 2 weeks of special services. Confession was taken by the priest giving those missions. Confession was a measure of success. The message had got through that people should turn their lives around, and they could express that by going to confession. Here again, the way some of the priests who were conducting these missions talked about them caught my attention. At one parish mission at a church in Omaha, there were 1,300 confessions after a 2-week, as a part of a 2-week mission, and the missionaries described that number as not great. So, confession was ingrained in Catholic practice and in Catholic identity. Parish activity turned on Saturday afternoon and evening as much as it did on Sunday morning. Well, what was the experience of confession like for different kinds of parishioners? First of all, most confessions were short. I've been able to calculate that the average time for a confession was about 2 minutes each. James Walsh in Boston one day heard 105 confessions in 4 3/4 hours. That divides out to 2 minutes and 30 seconds each on average. Patrick Healy in New York one day, 3 1/4 hours, 102 confessions, 1 minute and 50 seconds each. Confessions were short. They could obviously be longer in any given case, depending on the penitent. But they were usually short, and given the demand, there was a kind of incentive to keep the line moving. Remember that layman in New Orleans who praised one of the parish priests by saying that he didn't take all day. It was easy to get in and out relatively quickly. I also looked at the difference in the experience of confession between men and women. Women were perceived to be the more naturally religious sex, and priests thought they needed relatively little encouragement to come to confession. And it seems to me that more women than men probably did go to confession regularly. The data on this is very incomplete, but the gap between the two is less, frankly, than I expected it to be. There could be particular problems with the confession of women, especially when it came to the problem of to the question of the priest questioning them. The idea was that if a priest didn't quite understand from what the penitent had said what the sin involved was, the priest had to ask some questions. And priests were routinely encouraged to be careful with questions anyway, but particularly in asking questions of women, especially when it came to sexual sins. More than one seminary textbook warned against using questions to teach sin, as the textbook said. Don't give people ideas of things that they hadn't previously thought about by asking questions. But it was also the case that women were more likely to practice what were called devotional confessions. You really hadn't done anything wrong or anything seriously wrong to warrant confession, but you were encouraged to come to confession anyway, just to receive the grace of the sacrament, as the phrase was. As I say, women were, I think, more likely to practice devotional confessions. The confessions of children attracted some concern on the part of the church. Children learned how to go to confession while young. Until the 1960s, Catholic children went to confession for the first time when they were in the 2nd grade. So they're really quite young. And all the evidence suggests that the habits, the practices instilled when they're very young are continued into adulthood. And this is seen as increasingly a problem. One priest reported that he had a grown man confess to him that he had talked in church. Obviously a childhood sin that the man, now grown to be an adult, was still confessing. Very important in sorting out the experience of confession were questions of ethnicity and language. Confession was the only practice of the church until the 1960s, the only practice of the church that was not conducted primarily in Latin. It was conducted in the vernacular language of the parishioners. It was important that both parties, the penitent and the priest, understand what's being said. And so in parishes that had non-English speaking immigrant groups, how do you do that? There was an effort to get priests who spoke the language of the ethnic group in the community, but there were never enough to go around. And there were even guidebooks that were published in foreign languages that had, for the use of priests, that had the routine questions to ask in confession in English and in various foreign languages. And the idea was presumably that an English-speaking priest is hearing confessions, and someone who speaks Italian comes in, he could flip to the section of the book that had the Italian phrases in it and try to get through confession in that way. I have to think that these things were not really all that successful, kind of like tourist phrase books. And actually, one obvious solution to this problem was never attempted. Today, Anglo-speaking priests routinely learn Spanish. That was never attempted in the first half of the 20th century. I think the presumption was that the cultural barriers that came with language were simply too high, and that if an Irish priest could speak German, okay, but he'd never really be successful in a German parish. There would still be a cultural gap. And lastly, I looked at the experience of confession for certain what you might call special populations, the most obvious of which are confessions for the deaf and hard of hearing. Confession was an oral process. It relied on speaking and listening. How do you conduct confession with someone who can't hear? And a number of solutions were proposed to that. Well, do it privately in the rectory. The penitent could write out their sins, but that would be less good because, of course, it would create a record of their sins, which would have to be destroyed otherwise. And there were even technological solutions to that. Installing hearing aid devices basically inside confessional booths. Most dramatic, perhaps, of these special populations were soldiers in wartime, chaplains during wartime, hearing confessions of soldiers about to go into battle. Conceivably, they're about to meet their end. The idea was to give them the opportunity to go to confession to sort of clear their slate, just in case anything had happened. Well, what were all these people confessing? What were they talking about in the confessional? And fundamentally, of course, we can't know. The privacy of the practice, an oral exchange between two people, all the evidence of it disappears with the sound of the spoken words. And that was reinforced by the notion of the seal of the confessional, that anything that was said in the confessional was private, could never be repeated, and there were severe penalties for any priest who violated the seal, who disclosed what he had heard in the confessional. The seriousness with which that issue was addressed, it was a kind of reassurance to parishioners that there wouldn't be any consequences outside the confessional for what they had said. The subject of confessions, of course, all turned on the Catholic understanding of sin, which was highly articulated, highly elaborated, all kinds of overlapping categories, mortal and venial sins, sins of omission, sins of commission, and so on. Probably the most basic that parishioners focused on was the difference between mortal sins, very serious sins, and venial sins, lesser sins. And there were very precise ways of determining which was which. And drawing fine distinctions. One that I remember is the biblical commandment to rest on the Sabbath, led in catechism instruction and otherwise to talk about doing servile work, heavy work on Sundays. And there's in the literature there's distinction between, well, how much how much servile work can you do before a venial sin becomes a mortal sin? Just the fact that it was thought that things had to be made that precise was a measure of the seriousness with which all the participants took this. There's also consideration of what were called the occasions of sin, not sins themselves, but circumstances which might lead you into sin. You had to be on the watch for those as well. All of this method of analysis was available in examinations of conscience. Most instruction urged people going to confession to sort of review the 10 Commandments first. Have I sinned against any of those? And then the so-called precepts of the church, the Mass on Sunday, and so on. And that method of instruction, particularly in catechism, among students, was rigorously formed. And it gave individual Catholics, I think, the words to use in confession. It gave them a method of mental analysis that they could judge their own behavior. Sin, in some ways, was everywhere, but I think more precisely, sin might be anywhere. And as a result, you had to be constantly on the watch for it. Well, what about the other side of the screen in the confessional? I was interested to know how priests were trained to hear all those confessions. Classes in moral theology got more attention in seminary training than almost any other topic. And it was taught through the use of manuals and guides, applying general principles to particular situations and actions. And the classes in moral theology that priests had in the seminary strung out an endless, seemingly, series of cases. One that I remember is someone comes into the confessional and confesses to cheating on the trolley fares. That's obviously a sin, but how great a sin? Does it get more serious over time? If he's cheating the trolley company out of a nickel a week, does he have to make that back up to the trolley company somehow? Just the fact that the cases were analyzed in that kind of way showed, I think, the moral seriousness. It was not just a question of, do good and avoid evil. There are particular circumstances that need to be analyzed. Now, of course, priests could not hear confessions until they were priests, until after they were ordained. So this wasn't something they could practice while they were in the seminary. Instead, there were oral examinations that seminarians took before a board of seminary professors, in which the professors would present a case. A housewife comes into your confessional and confesses the following. What's your analysis? How would you deal with this problem? These were oral exams in front of professors, and I was surprised to learn other seminarians were encouraged to come to these exams as well. So you're not just being examined by your professors, you were being examined in front of your friends as well. The idea was that they would learn something from your mistakes, perhaps. But even better, I think the sense was that priests should start hearing confessions immediately when they're first assigned to a parish. And I think what that meant was that most priests learned how to hear confessions, mostly just by doing it. If they're hearing only 88 at a time, they're going to be getting, obviously, some practice. Well, all of that describes the rise and the flourishing of confession until the middle decades of the 20th century. Not everybody was going to confession, and there were some variations in regularity depending on one's age and status in life. There were also some ethnic variations. Irish and Germans came from cultures in which monthly confession was expected, whereas East Europeans, Poles and Lithuanians, for example, came from cultures in which annual confession was perfectly fine, and they weren't necessarily encouraged to more than that. But as late as 1965, 38% of American Catholics say they are going to confession monthly, and only 18% say they are going never or practically never. That's 1965. 10 years later, those numbers are almost exactly reversed as to the monthly and the never. So how to explain that turnaround, what I call a collapse of the practice of confession? Several things seem relevant. First, there were, even as Catholics were confessing in large numbers, they were accumulating a number of dissatisfactions with the practice. Catholics never particularly liked to go to confession. They did because they thought they should, but they never really liked it. And some of those dissatisfactions were personal. The priest scolded them or asked them too many questions. Some people objected to the speed, the 2 minutes per confession. Now, many people obviously liked the fact that confession was over in 2 minutes. But some people were unhappy with that. The priest cutting them off when they're in the midst of what they're saying. The gap between the seriousness of the sacramental work which the church told them they were doing and the speed with which it was being done came to rankle with many people. I think especially as levels of Catholic education rise. I think lay people are thinking that it's okay for them to be dissatisfied with that speed. And also related here, I think, was the triviality of much of what was confessed. Suddenly, people going to confession sort of noticed this. The grown man who confessed to talking in church. There had to be a part of him that thought, really? Should I be talking about that? And of course, the impact of Vatican II here, with the laity newly authorized to take charge personally of their own spiritual development. I think that all contributed to the accumulation of these dissatisfactions. There was, of course, particular dissatisfaction over the question of contraception. The Church's position on contraception had the virtue of consistency and was restated over time. Any explicit effort to prevent contraception was always sinful and always seriously so. And moreover, in the confessional, the question of contraception raised the problem of what was called recidivism. The thought was that someone who confessed to practicing contraception had probably been doing so over a certain period of time and might very well be likely to continue to do so. And that was seen as lacking what was called the purpose of amendment. I know I've done wrong, I have to try not to do it again. With contraception, that seemed off the table. Some indications in the 1960s that the Church's teaching on contraception might change were not realized in 1968 when the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae reaffirmed the traditional Catholic position on the sinfulness of contraception. And in America and elsewhere, lay people, both men and women, increasingly rejected that teaching. I found one man saying on the subject, he said, all of a sudden, I don't think this is sinful anymore. Just the fact that he could come to say that, I think, was a sign that this was just, Catholics weren't convinced that this was something that needed to be confessed. They didn't think it was sinful, and they didn't think that they should have to act as if they did think it was sinful. I think that was a particularly problematic issue. We know that there were informal networks of women in the aftermath of Humanae Vitae, giving advice on where women could go, what priests and what parishes were willing to talk to you about contraception. We're maybe going to go a little easier. I think all of that had a cumulative effect. It was a short step to not mentioning contraception in confession, a short step from that to not going to confession at all, and I think that contributed to the decline. Now, the opposition to contraception did not cause the collapse of practice all on its own. But I think it was of a piece with a general reconsideration of the nature of sin that was going on in the 1960s. Yes, there are still plenty of individual sins that people commit. But there are also larger social kinds of sins. Racism, sexism, militarism, damaging the environment, unjust economic structures, and so on. All of that is sinful as well. And in fact, isn't that more sinful than some of the more trivial things that people talked about that? This was a new, for my money, positive way of thinking about good and evil, about good and bad behavior. But the problem, I think, was that was difficult to talk about in the structure of confession. How was an individual to claim their own personal share of responsibility in those larger sins? Damaging the environment is sinful. I agree with that. How do I claim my personal share of that? I started the car this morning. How do I sort this out morally? I think confession, as it had been practiced, didn't fit with that larger viewpoint, and that contributed to the decline. And lastly, the acceptance of the ideas and concepts of modern psychology, I think, undercut the practice of confession. Confession had always assumed that it was relatively easy to tell right from wrong, and that sin was deliberately choosing to do the wrong thing. What we learned from psychology, it seemed, was that human behavior was a lot more complicated than that. The unconscious was sometimes as much of a motive as the conscious one. And I think it was difficult to gel those ideas which were spreading in modern American society and relying on other credentialed professionals, psychologists, counselors of all kinds. I think that undercut confession as well. And all of those factors that I've been talking about in the last quarter of the 20th century and into the 21st century helped to undercut confession. I should also say something here about clergy sexual abuse, as it became widely known just after the turn of the present century. Abuse itself, we now know, is not new. Widespread awareness of it was new. And further, we know that the confessional itself was often used in abuse. Abusive priests targeted, groomed potential victims as a part of confession. And the confessional itself was sometimes the location of the crime/sin, especially after the introduction of face-to-face confession, where there's no physical barrier between the priest and the penitent again. Abuse became more likely, not necessarily common, but became more likely to happen than it had otherwise been. So given the timing of the widespread knowledge of abuse, starting in 2002, more or less, again, that didn't contribute to the decline of confession. That was already well underway. But I think it makes it very difficult to imagine that there will be a widespread return to confession now. Who or what is on the other side of the screen? What about the danger, the potential danger for oneself, for one's children? I think Catholics can't come to terms with those. Abusers themselves, of course, had heard countless numbers of confessions over the course of their priestly careers. What did absolution and forgiveness from them even mean? I think we're still trying to sort out the meanings of the sexual abuse awareness in general, and I think in particular as it relates to confession. We need more study of that. So, where does this leave us? The old world of thousands of Catholics going to confession regularly are gone. And you can see this now in the hours that most parishes set aside for confessions. No more 3 to 6 and 7 to 9:30 on Saturday. Most parishes that I know of set aside an hour or less for regular confessions. The supply has shrunk along with the demand, I think. Some reviewers of the book have noted various pockets of so-called revival of confession, especially, I will say, among Catholic college students. Here at Holy Cross, perhaps, at Boston College, where I am, there are students going to confession. they find it meaningful, it's not up to me, but for my money, that's great if they find it meaningful. But 10 years after graduation, without the supporting systems of their friends, of the Catholic college, will they still be going to confession? The evidence seems to suggest not. So faced with that reality, that the older form of confession just doesn't speak to people anymore as it once did, that, it seems to me, is a real loss. The genius of the confessional system was that it got people to think about themselves and their own behavior, the accountability for what they had done, for their behavior. My sins were my sins, and the old system encouraged that, and it seems to me that sense is increasingly lost. In my view, that means we need some new form for expressing the ideas that were behind the traditional practice. But as a historian, I have no idea what that new form will be, let alone what it should be. The future isn't my job as a historian, but I think the church has the responsibility to try to figure this out. And that process, which may well take several hundred years, will be improved, I hope, by the insights that history can offer, even if history can't answer all the questions. So, thanks very much.